A sharp screech of metal on wood cut right through the quiet night as Owen Newcomb pushed open the heavy door to his barn. He held his lantern up high, the flame dancing around, making long, spooky shadows jump across the hay-covered floor. It had been a long, hard day working his ranch just outside of Amarillo, Texas, and all he really wanted was to check on his prize mare before heading in for the night. But then, a soft little gasp from a dark corner of the barn told him he was not alone. "Who's there?" Owen called out, his voice low and steady as he raised the lantern just a little bit higher. His free hand, without him even thinking about it, went straight to the holster on his hip. "Show yourself." For a long moment, not a thing moved. Then, ever so slowly, a figure started to rise up from behind a big stack of hay bales. It was a woman, dusty and disheveled, but there was no denying she was beautiful, even in the sorry state she was in. She stood before him, her big dark eyes wide with pure fear. Her dress was torn clear up at the bottom, caked with the kind of dust you get from a long, hard trail, and her hair hung down in tangled waves all around her shoulders. "Please," she whispered, and her voice was raspy and tired. "I don't mean any harm. I just needed a safe place to rest for a bit." Owen looked her over carefully, his gaze stopping on the dark bruise that was just starting to blossom on her cheekbone. The way she was holding her left arm tight against her chest. This was not some drifter, just looking for a free meal. No, this woman was running hard from something, or someone. "You are running from something," he said softly, lowering his rifle but keeping his eyes locked on hers. "Let me help you." The woman went stiff as a board. "I do not need your charity." "This is not charity," Owen replied, hanging his lantern on a hook on a nearby post. "It is just common decency. My name is Owen Newcomb, and this here is my ranch. And who might you be?" She hesitated, her eyes glancing toward the barn door, as if she was calculating her odds of escape. Finally, her voice came out, barely a whisper. "Victoria, Victoria Thornton." "Well, Miss Thornton, you look like you could surely use a warm meal and a safe place to rest your head." "I have got both." Victoria's eyes narrowed with a deep, weary suspicion. "And what would you be wanting in return for that, Mr. Newcomb?" Owen just shook his head slowly, understanding her caution all too well. It was 1878, and a woman all alone had every reason to be careful. "I want nothing but the truth, whenever you are ready to give it. Until then, you are welcome to stay in my guest room. The main house is just right up that hill." Victoria's eyes darted between Owen's face and her eyes darted to the barn door. You could see her weighing it all. Whatever, or whoever, she was running from must have been 10 times scarier than the thought of trusting a complete stranger out here in the middle of nowhere. "Just for tonight," she finally whispered. But her whole body was still tense as a coiled snake. Owen just nodded. "Just for tonight, then." The walk up to the house was real quiet, except for the sound of their boots crunching down on the gravel path and the far-off howl of a lone coyote. Owen's ranch house was not anything grand, just a solid 2-story place built with his very own hands after he got back from the war, but it was clean and warm on the inside. "The kitchen's right this way," Owen said, gating her through the front door. "When was the last time you ate?" Victoria's stomach decided to answer for her with a growl that was loud enough for them both to hear. A faint blush crept up her neck. "Yesterday morning, I think." Owen just lit the stove and reached for a pot. "Well, I have got some stew left from supper. It is not a feast, but it will fill that empty spot until morning." While he was heating up the meal, Owen did his best not to stare at his surprising guest. In the better light of the kitchen, he could see that beneath all that dirt and bone-deep tiredness, Victoria Thornton was truly remarkable. A truly striking woman. Her hair, which he could now see was a deep, rich auburn, was starting to fall from what had clearly been a very neat hairstyle earlier in the day. Her eyes were dark and bone-tired, but they didn't miss a thing as she looked around the little room. "Your home is very well kept," she said, and you could hear the surprise in her voice. Owen offered a small smile. "My mama wouldn't have stood for it any other way. She taught me right before she passed on." He set a steaming bowl of stew and a thick slice of bread on the table for her. Victoria didn't waste a single moment. She ate with a desperate kind of hunger, the kind that comes from not knowing where your next meal is coming from. "There's plenty more if you'd like," Owen said softly. Victoria stopped, the bread held halfway to her mouth. "Why are you doing this?" You don't even know me. Owen leaned against the kitchen counter, taking a moment to consider her question. Well, I reckon everyone deserves a helping hand now and then. About 6 years ago, I came home from the war with nothing but bad dreams and a leg that didn't work right. If it hadn't been for the kindness of complete strangers, I wouldn't be here today. Something in his quiet words seemed to get through to her, and Victoria's shoulders seemed to lose some of their tension. Thank you, she said, her voice barely a whisper, letting her return to her meal when she was all finished. Then Owen showed her to a small guest room at the top of the stairs. The bathroom is down the hall if you want to get cleaned up. There ought to be some of my mother's old things in that trunk if you need a change of clothes. Victoria stood there awkwardly in the doorway, her fingers gripping the old, worn fabric of her dress. Mr. Newhome. Owen, he corrected her gently. Owen, she repeated, and the name sounded so unfamiliar in her own mouth. I will not be here when you wake up. I have to keep on moving. He nodded, seeming to understand the weight behind her words. The door does not lock from the outside, Miss Thornton. You are free to go whenever you please. But if you are running from something real dangerous, maybe you should consider that two heads are better than one when it comes to solving a problem. Victoria did not answer him, but the little tremble in her lower lip told Owen everything he really needed to know. Whatever trouble had come looking for this woman, it was not some small matter. Good night, Miss Thornton, he said, tipping his hat just a bit before he turned away. Sleep well now. Owen woke up before the sun did, just like he always did. He moved quietly through his morning routine. With his guest still on his mind, a part of him half reckoned he would find the guest room empty, with the front door left ajar in her hurry to get back on her way. But as he made his way down the stairs, a sound he had not heard in a long time from the kitchen made him pause. Victoria was standing there at the stove with her back to him. She had found one of his mama's old dresses, a simple blue cotton thing that hung a little loose on her, but it was a whole lot cleaner than what she had arrived in. Her hair, all clean and brushed, was tied back with a simple ribbon. Well, you're still here, Owen said, unable to keep the genuine surprise out of his voice. Victoria turned, holding a spatula. I figured I should earn my keep before I leave. It is not much, but I made us some eggs. Owen moved toward the table and saw that it had been set for two. You did not have to do that. I wanted to, she replied simply, bringing the pan right to the table and dividing the eggs up between their plates. Besides, I realized I do not rightly have anywhere else to go right now. Owen nodded, understanding the unspoken request to stay a little longer. You are welcome here for as long as you need. They ate their breakfast in a comfortable, quiet peace. A few quiet minutes passed before Victoria finally spoke up again. I was looking out the window at all your land. You don't really run this whole place all by yourself, do you? For the most part, Owen said. I hire on some hands during planting and harvest and for the big cattle drives. But the day-to-day work, well, that is just me. Victoria's eyes widened a little. My goodness, that is a powerful lot of work for one man. Owen just shrugged. It keeps my hands busy, and it keeps the old memories from creeping in. He had not meant to say that last part out loud, and he quickly changed the subject. Well, if you are staying a while, I suppose I should introduce you to the rest of the property. After they finished breakfast, Owen showed Victoria all around his ranch. The main house sat up on a gentle little hill, looking out over acres of rolling pasture and farmland. A small, clear creek cut right through the property, providing fresh water for his herd and for watering all of the crops. The old barn, the same one where they had met just last night, was home to 4 fine horses, including Owen's own favorite mare, a beauty named Duchess. Oh, she is just beautiful, Victoria said, reaching out a slightly hesitant hand to stroke the horse's neck. She is as stubborn as a Texas mule, but she is a truly loyal girl, Owen replied, watching as Duchess gently leaned right into Victoria's touch. Well, I will be. Seems she has taken a shine to you. Victoria smiled. It was the first real smile Owen had seen from her, and it just lit up her whole face. I had a horse when I was just a little girl, she said. My daddy taught me to ride before I could hardly even walk. Well, I bet you ride well then. Victoria just nodded, getting a faraway look in her eyes. I used to. It has been a long while. Well, now, if you are staying on, you are more than welcome to take Duchess out for a ride. She sure could use the company. Victoria's smile seemed to melt away. and that tired look came right back into her eyes. About that, how long do you suppose I might be able to stay here? I do have a little money. It is not much, but I can pay for my room and board. Owen just shook his head. You keep your money. You can stay here as long as you need to get things sorted out. In return, though, if you are willing, I sure could use a hand around this old house. My cooking is passable at best. Victoria looked him over, clearly trying to figure out if he had some kind of angle to his kindness. Just help around the house? She asked. Just housework, Owen confirmed, understanding exactly what she was worried about. You have my word as a gentleman. Some of the tightness seemed to leave Victoria's shoulders. Then you have yourself a deal, Mr. Nuomi. Owen, he corrected her again with a little smile. Owen, Victoria said again, and this time the name seemed to fit a little more comfortably on her tongue. As they walked back to the house, Owen just had to ask, will you tell me what you are running from, Victoria? Or maybe who? Victoria's step faltered for just a heartbeat. Not today, she said softly. Maybe not ever. Owen accepted that with a simple nod. Fair enough. But if trouble comes calling for you, I would sure rather not be caught flat-footed. Victoria stopped, walking completely, turning to face him. Her expression was serious, a stark change from moments before. If trouble ever comes looking for me, Mr. Nuom, your best move would be to hand me over without a single fight. I would not want your kindness to be repaid with real danger. Owen met her gaze and held it steady. I do not frighten easy, Miss Thornton, and I have never been the man to hand over someone who has come to me for protection. Their eyes locked for a long, silent moment, a quiet battle of wills. At last, Victoria was the one to look away. Then I pray it does not come to that. The following week fell into a comfortable and easy rhythm around the ranch. Victoria proved to be a capable housekeeper, and to Owen's delight, an excellent cook. He found himself actually looking forward to it, heading back to the ranch each evening. A warm meal and some friendly conversation were always there waiting for him. It had been a good many years since he'd shared his supper table with anyone regularly, and he hadn't quite realized how much he had missed the simple comfort of company. As for Victoria, well, she seemed to be unwinding a little more with every passing day. The tired shadows under her eyes began to fade, and she started to wander the property a little more freely. Owen often saw her sitting down by the creek with a book in her hand, or exercising Duchess out in the corral. Now she was still mighty private about her past, and could sidestep a personal question with a well-practiced grace. But that constant fear that he'd first seen in her eyes had finally started to dim. Then, on Sunday morning, Owen came downstairs to find Victoria wearing one of his own mother's nicer dresses, a pale yellow one with some pretty lace at the collar. I was thinking I might go to church with you, she said as she smoothed her hands down over the old fabric, a little nervously. That is, if you're fixin' to go, and if it won't cause too much of a stir to have me along. And Owen, who had for sure been fixin' to head to the weekly service in Amarillo, he said with a warm smile, I'd be mighty pleased to have you right along. As for all that talk, well, that's just what keeps a small town buzzin'. It is best not to pay it any mind. The ride on into town was a nice one, with the early summer sun warming things up just right. Victoria sat up straight beside Owen in the wagon, her back as straight as a board, but you could see her hands were a little restless with her handbag. Feeling a little nervous? Owen asked gently as the church steeple poked up over the horizon. Just a little, Victoria admitted in a quiet voice. It has been quite a while since I have been around so many folks at once. Now the people here are good people, for the most part, Owen assured her. A little curious, sure, but good-hearted. If anyone gets to asking, we will just tell them you are a friend of the family, here to stay for the summer. Victoria gave a small nod, taking a slow, deep breath as Owen eased the wagon to a stop not far from the church. He hopped down and helped her to the ground, offering his arm as they started toward the white clapboard building. More than a few heads turned to watch them, with curious eyes, taking in the new face standing right there at Owen's side. Well, I will be. Owen Newcomb, is that really you with a lady on your arm? A big, booming voice called out. A large man with a sheriff's star pinned right there on his chest walked toward them with a big grin, grinning like a possum. Well, I'll be. The world must be coming to an end. Owen just shook his head but smiled at his longtime friend, Sheriff Wade Rogers. Wade, allow me to introduce Miss Victoria Thornton. She'll be a guest out at my ranch for a little while. Wade's eyebrows shot up with surprise, but he tipped his hat like a true gentleman. Miss Thornton, it is a real pleasure. Any friend of Owen's is always welcome here in Amarillo, Victoria answered with a quiet nod, her hand clutching just a bit tighter on Owen's arm. More introductions came and went as other folks from town filed in for the sermon. Owen noticed that Victoria got all tense whenever new people came up to them, but she would relax a little once they moved on without asking a whole lot of questions. The service was about the same as always, though Owen found his mind wandering, distracted by Victoria's presence there next to him. He was mighty used to coming to church by himself, sitting in that same old pew near the back. Having Victoria share his songbook, with her shoulder gently brushing against his, was a brand new feeling that made him more aware of her than he was ready to admit. When the service was over, they politely said no to a few invitations for Sunday dinner, much to the dismay of a couple of the town's ladies who loved to play matchmaker. I've got to go check on the new calves, Owen said. Maybe some other time. On the wagon ride back to the ranch, Victoria grew quiet, lost in her thoughts. Your friends seem like good people, she finally said. Especially that sheriff. Owen just nodded. Me and Wade, we served in the war together. He is a good man, fair and honest as they come. Victoria turned to look him square in the eye. Would he be the kind of man to help someone in a bad spot? Even someone who might be wanted by the law somewhere else? Owen's grip tightened on the leather reins. Wade believes in doing what is right, not just what is written in a law book. If somebody was in real trouble, he would hear their side of it before judging them. He paused for a moment, weighing his next words. Is that the kind of a situation you are in, Victoria? Are you running from the law? Victoria looked away, her face turned toward the open and endless Texas plains. Not exactly, she said softly, but the man I am running from has the law in his back pocket where he comes from. It was the most she had ever shared about her troubles since she arrived, and Owen knew better than to push her for any more. Well, if it comes to that, Wade would surely listen to your side of the story. So would I, Owen said softly. Victoria did not say a word, but you could see the tension ease from her shoulders as the ranch buildings finally came into view. Thank you for taking me to church today, she said quietly as Owen reached up to help her down from the wagon. It felt normal. I have not felt that way in a very long while. Owen just smiled and tipped his hat. The pleasure was all mine, Miss Thornton. Later that night, and they were sitting together on the porch after a good supper, just watching that big Texas sun paint the whole sky with streaks of orange and deep pink. That is when Owen felt a real change come over Victoria. She seemed more at peace with herself, less like a spooked doe ready to bolt at the first crack of a twig. I was supposed to be married, she said out of the blue, her voice just a whisper, breaking the easy quiet that had settled down between them. Back home in Missouri. Owen turned to really look at her, taken aback by this sudden confession. Victoria just gave a small, sad nod, her gaze lost somewhere on the dark horizon. His name was Randall Porter. His family pretty much owns half the businesses in our county, including the very bank where my own father worked. She had to take a deep breath then. My father, he passed on last year from a heart condition, she explained. Right after the funeral, Mr. Porter, that is Randall's father, he came to inform me that my father had supposedly taken out some very large loans that they claimed were suddenly due in full. Owen's brow furrowed. Well, that just does not sound right. It was not, Victoria said, her tone firming up. My father was the most honorable man I have ever known. He would never in his life take on a debt he could not settle. But I did not have any proof, just my word against theirs. So they backed you into a corner, making you agree to marry that Randall fellow to wipe the slate clean, Owen figured. Victoria just nodded, her fingers lightly tracing that faint scar on her cheek, the one Owen had noticed the very first time they met. Randall is a cruel man. He hides it real well in public, always playing the part of the perfect, devoted fiancé. But behind closed doors, she shivered just thinking about it. When I finally told him I was breaking off our engagement, he made it crystal clear that was not an option. A hot flash of anger shot through Owen for this man he had never met who had hurt her so badly. So you ran. I ran, Victoria confirmed. I gathered up what little money I had managed to save, took a few pieces of jewelry that had been my mother's, and I slipped it away in the dead of night. I have been on the road for almost 2 months now, taking whatever odd jobs I could find, and always moving on the second I heard whispers of some man asking questions about a woman who looked a lot like me. And that's how you wound up in my barn, Owen said softly. He finished her sentence for her. A small smile touched Victoria's lips. Yes, I ended up in your barn. I was only planning to rest for a little while, just a few hours before I kept heading west. I just never expected. Her voice trailed off. She looked at Owen with an expression he could not quite figure out. It was a mix of wonder and weariness. You never expected what? He prompted gently. Victoria shook her head. I never in a million years expected to find somebody who would actually help me. Someone who didn't want a single thing from me in return. It just feels too good to be true most of the time. You know, Owen reached his hand across the small space between them. He paused for just a second before covering her hand with his own. Not everybody is out to get something, Victoria. Some folks just want to lend a hand, that is all. Victoria looked down at their hands resting together. She looked at his calloused hand covering hers, but she did not pull away. I am starting to believe that you might be telling the truth. The next morning, Owen was up and at it before the sun. It was his usual routine. He moved through his morning chores. He worked with a steady rhythm he had known his whole life, but his mind was still turning over everything Victoria had told him. He kept replaying her words from the night before. Her story explained so much, like the deep weariness in her eyes. It explained why she was so hesitant to be seen in town. And it sure explained those awful nightmares he sometimes heard in the night. The house in the middle of the night. While he was out fixing a fence on the north pasture, he spied a rider coming his way from the direction of town. He stood up straight and recognized Wade Rogers, with his broad shoulders and that familiar hat. Morning, Owen, Wade called out as he rode up closer. Hope I am not interrupting you. Owen put his tools down. It is nothing that cannot wait. What brings you all the way out here on a Monday morning? Wade swung down from his horse, tying the reins to the fence post. Came with some news, mostly. I got a wire from a sheriff over in Missouri. He is looking for a woman, Victoria Thornton. He says she is wanted on account of theft. Owen's face did not change one bit, though deep inside his heart started pounding. Is that fact? Wade looked him over real careful. The description they gave fits your house guest pretty darn well. Reddish-brown hair, dark eyes, somewhere around 25 years old. He paused for a moment. The wire says she took off with some valuable jewelry and a good bit of money from her fiancé's family right before she just up and vanished. Owen folded his arms across his chest. And you believe that story? Now, I did not say that, Wade replied, his voice steady. I know you well enough to figure there is more to this story. More to this story. That's why I made the ride out here myself instead of just hauling her straight in. Owen was mighty grateful for his friend's good sense. She was supposed to marry this man, Randall Porter. From what she's told me, he treated her real poorly. The jewelry she took belonged to her own mother, and that money was her own hard-earned savings. The Porters had been squeezing her for cash, claiming her father left debts that I reckon were cooked up out of thin air. Wade nodded slowly. I had a gut feeling it might be something just like that. The telegram came with an awfully large reward for a simple theft case, he sighed. Still, I can't rightly just ignore an official request from another lawman. So what are you fixing to do? Owen asked, the tension clear in his voice. I'm going to make some quiet inquiries, Wade said. I've got some folks I know over in that region who might be able to tell me a little more about this Porter family. In the meantime, you might ought to consider moving Miss Thornton someplace a little less obvious, just in case. Owen nodded, grateful for the warning. I surely do appreciate this, Wade. Don't you thank me yet, the sheriff cautioned. If it turns out she's telling the God's honest truth, I'll do what I can to help. But if I find out otherwise, well, he let the thought just hang in the air. She's telling the truth, Owen said, his voice firm. I would bet my life on it. Wade gave him a long, hard look, trying to read him. You have known her for what, a week, and you are already this certain? Owen did not have a logical explanation for his certainty. He just knew, deep down in his gut, that Victoria was the real deal. Some things you just know in your bones, Wade. The sheriff shook his head, a knowing little smile playing on his lips. I have not seen that look on your face since way before the war, Owen. You best be careful that your heart does not start clouding your judgment. Owen wanted to argue to deny that his feelings for Victoria were anything more than a neighborly concern, but the words caught in his throat. He had not allowed himself to look at those feelings too closely, but Wade's observation forced him to face them. There was just something about Victoria that had woken up parts of him he figured had died on some battlefield years ago. Just do what you can, Owen said instead. And if you hear a whisper about someone coming to look for her, you will be the first to know, Wade promised, untying his horse. In the meantime, you might ought to think about taking that trip out to your uncle's old place down near the New Mexico border. Could be a fine time to go check on those Mustangs you've been talking about. Owen gave a slow nod, catching his drift. I'll surely think on it. After Wade rode off, Owen turned and headed back to the house, his mind churning like a dust devil. He found Victoria out in the garden, picking some fresh vegetables for their supper. She looked up when she heard him coming, a sweet smile spreading across her face that just about made his heart skip a beat. You are back sooner than I figured, she said, her brow furrowing a little. Is something the matter? Owen knew there was no sense in beating around the bush. He had to tell her straight. Wade came by. There is a wire that came in from Missouri asking questions about you. Well, the color just vanished from Victoria's face, and the wicker basket she was holding just slipped right from her fingers, sending red tomatoes scattering all across the dusty ground. He has found me, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Owen closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, steadying her with his hands on her shoulders. Now listen, Wade is on our side in this. He is going to look into this Porter fellow's claims before he does a single thing. But Victoria's eyes, just wide with pure terror, searched his face for any hope. But what if he feels he has to turn me in? What then? That is not going to happen, Owen said, his voice steady as a rock. Wade seemed to think we ought to get out of town for a bit, just to be on the safe side. I have an uncle with a piece of land down near the New Mexico line. It is way out there, mighty hard to stumble upon unless you know exactly where you are headed. Victoria just shook her head. I cannot ask you to turn your whole life upside down for my sake. You have already done more than enough. You are not asking. I am telling you what we are doing, Owen answered back. Besides all that, I have been meaning to go check on that old place anyway. There is a herd of wild Mustangs out there that my uncle used to watch over. But Victoria still looked unsure of it all. What about this ranch and your cattle? I can get my neighbor Jim Wilkins to watch over things for a spell. It certainly would not be the first time. Owen gave her shoulders a gentle, reassuring squeeze. So what do you say, Victoria? Will you ride with me? Victoria drew in a long, shaky breath. When would we have to leave? We will head out at first light tomorrow. It is a hard 3-day ride if we really push it. Victoria gave a firm nod, her mind made up. Well then, we had better get to packing our things. So they spent the rest of that day getting ready for their long journey. Owen rode on over to the Wilkins Ranch to make arrangements for the care of his livestock. And all the while, Victoria, they packed up all the food and clothes they would need. By the time the sun went down, everything was set for an early start in the morning. As they sat down for what could be their very last supper at the ranch for a good long while, a heavy silence hung in the air between them. Victoria had been awfully quiet ever since Owen had given her the news, her mind clearly a million miles away. We are going to be all right, Owen said, trying his best to comfort her. My uncle's place is hidden away real good, and Wade will send us a message when it is safe to come back home. Victoria just poked at the food on her plate. But what if it is never safe to come back? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What if Randall never stops looking for me? Owen reached across the old wooden table, gently covering her hand with his own. Then we will figure something else out together. We could get a fresh start somewhere entirely new. Maybe California or shoot, even Canada. Victoria looked up, and the surprise was plain as day in her eyes. We. Owen realized his mistake a second too late. I only meant, that is, if you wanted to have the company. I thank you, Victoria said, cutting him off as she turned her hand to squeeze his tightly. For saying yeah, for making me feel like I am not facing this all by myself. Owen's heart swelled up with warmth at her words. You are not alone, Victoria. Not anymore. Their eyes locked for a moment that seemed to stretch on, a whole conversation happening without a single word. Then Victoria finally pulled her hand away, a warm blush creeping up her cheeks. We ought to get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a mighty long day. Owen just nodded, getting to his feet to clear the plates. You are right about that. I will wake you before the sun does. They set out right as the very first hints of daylight started to crack over the eastern horizon. Owen had saddled up the mare, Duchess, for Victoria and his own gelding, Thunder, um, for himself. Two pack horses were loaded down with their supplies and the few things they called their own. As they rode away from the ranch, Owen could not help but glance back at the house that had been his home for the past 6 years. He had never been away from it for more than a couple of days since he put down roots there after the war. We will come back, Victoria said, her voice soft, almost as if she could read his mind, when it is safe. Owen gave a slow nod, turning his gaze forward again. I know we will. The first day on the trail was quiet enough. They rode straight across the wide open plains of the Texas Panhandle, while the June sun beat down on them without any mercy. Victoria turned out to be an exceptional rider, just as she had promised. She kept pace with Owen without a single complaint, even though the journey was as tough as a $2 steak. They finally made camp that night beside a small, trickling creek, a good ways off any real trail. As they settled by the fire after supper, Victoria seemed a little more at ease than she had been since that telegram first showed up. So, tell me about this place we are headed to, she said, pulling her arms tight around her knees. Your uncle's ranch. Owen poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks flying up into the dark night sky. Well, it is not much of a ranch, to tell you the truth. More like a line shack with some decent grazing land all around it. My uncle was a bit of a hermit. He always preferred the company of wild horses over people. Sounds like quite a character, Victoria remarked quietly. Owen managed a small smile, thinking of his odd old relative. Oh, he surely was. He taught me more about horses than any other soul ever could have. He passed on a few years ago. Left that whole place to me. I have been meaning to get out there, maybe fix it up some, but I just never seemed to get around to it. Victoria stared deep into the dancing flames, and now you are going there, all because of me. Leaving your own home, your way of life. It is just a place, Victoria, Owen said, his voice low, and the cattle will still be there when we get back. Some things are just plain more important. Victoria lifted her head to look at him, her eyes just shimmering in the glow of the fire. Tell me the real reason you're helping me, Owen. And do not tell me it is just common decency. A person does not risk so much for a complete stranger just because it is the right thing to do. Owen thought on her question for a long moment. When I came home from the war, I was a broken man. Not just my leg, but something deep inside. I had seen things and done things that followed me in my sleep. For a good long while, I did not believe I deserved anything good to ever happen to me. Victoria listened to every word, her whole expression softening. Then one day, an old-timer found me passed out drunk behind a saloon over in Albuquerque. Instead of just leaving me in the dirt, he pulled me up onto my feet, gave me honest work on his ranch, and taught me how to live my life again. Owen smiled thinking back on it. He had no earthly reason to help me, but he did it anyway. It changed my whole life. So when I found you hiding in my barn, I just figured maybe it was my turn to pass that kind of help on down the line. Victoria's eyes were glistening, full of tears she was holding back. That is a very good answer, she whispered softly. It is the truth, Owen replied, but I have to admit there is more to it now. He stopped, not quite sure how to say what he was starting to feel for her without scaring her away. But Victoria saved him from the struggle. I know, she said, real soft. I feel it too. That one little admission just hung there in the air, as delicate as a web in the morning dew. Neither one of them moved to close the space between them, but you could feel that something had shifted. A door had just opened that could never be properly closed again. We should probably get some sleep, Owen finally said, his voice a little rough. It was going to be another long day tomorrow. Victoria nodded, but her eyes held onto his face for just a beat longer before she slipped away into her bedroom. Owen sat there by the fire long after Victoria had drifted off to sleep, just turning their quiet conversation over and over in his mind. He certainly had not planned on developing feelings for his mysterious guest, and Lord knows the timing could not be any worse, but there was simply no denying the truth of the matter. Now, somewhere between finding her hiding in his barn and riding away from his own ranch with her, Victoria Thornton had gone and become important to him in a way no one had been in a very, very long time. The following morning brought a sky full of clouds and the promise of rain. They broke down their camp quickly, hoping to make some good progress before the weather decided to turn on them. By midday, the skies had darkened to a bruised purple, and thunder began to rumble way off in the distance. "There is a trading post about a 1-hour ride from here," Owen called out, right over his shoulder. "I reckon we can wait out this here storm in there." Victoria gave a firm nod, pulling her coat up tighter against that biting wind. "Lead on," she said. They spurred their horses, urging them on, trying to beat that fast-moving thunderhead. The first big old drops of rain started to splash down just as that trading post finally came into sight, a solid-looking log building with a corral and a little stable tacked on. As they swung down from their saddles, the sky just opened up in a real gully washer, sending them scrambling for the cover of that building. Inside, the place was warm and cozy and dry as a bone, with a pot-bellied stove glowing hot in the corner. Looked like a few other folks had the same idea, hunkered down from the storm, gathered round the tables with their coffee, or maybe something stronger. The owner, a grizzled old fellow with just one good eye, gave Owen a slow nod. "Well now, Newcomb, it has been a spell." "Harlan," Owen said, just as stated. "Just passing through. This here's Miss Thornton." Harlan's one good eye stayed on Victoria a second longer than was proper. "Ma'am," he finally grunted, "coffee's hot if you're wanting some. Got some stew simmering on the stove, too." "Some coffee would be a blessing," Victoria said warmly. "For the both of us, please." They picked out a table tucked away in the corner, far from the other folks inside. The trading post was pretty much the only stop for travelers out in these remote parts, offering up some basic supplies and simple, hot meals, and sometimes a room for those who got caught in a spell of bad weather. "Well, it looks like this storm is fixing to settle in," Owen said, glancing out the window at the rain coming down sideways. "We might just need to stay the night." Victoria stiffened up, her eyes nervously scanning the room. She wondered if it was safe. Owen whispered, "Harlan runs a respectable place. Just mind your own business." "And he'll mind his. We ought to be fine for just one single night." Victoria nodded, though you could tell she wasn't about to relax. Owen understood why she was so on edge. Every new face they saw was a possible danger. Every stop they made was a new chance for Randall Porter to finally catch up with them. Harlan came over carrying 2 mugs of hot coffee and 2 bowls of thick, hearty stew. "I've got one room left if you folks are staying," he said, his one good eye locked right on Owen. "It has 2 beds." Owen said, "We will take it," as he slid some coins across the wooden table. Harlan pocketed the money. "It is up the stairs. The very last door on the left. I will make sure your horses are looked after." As they began to eat, Owen noticed that Victoria, watching a man who had just stepped inside, shaking the cold night rain from his long coat. Something about him sent a shiver down her spine. "What is it, darling?" Owen asked, his voice low. Victoria leaned in close, her words barely a whisper. "That fella over there, I know I have seen him before, back in Amarillo. He was nosing around asking questions at the general store." Owen took a slow, easy look over at the newcomer, a skinny man with a tidy beard and expensive city clothes that marked him as a stranger in this dusty little outpost. "Are you certain?" Victoria nodded, her knuckles turning bone white around her warm coffee mug. He works for Randall's father. His name is Morris." A cold feeling washed over Owen, and it had nothing to do with the storm outside. "He has not seen you yet. Just keep your head down. I will handle this." Victoria did not argue. She just turned her face away from the room and toward the wooden wall. Owen watched as Harlan showed the new arrival to a table on the far side of the room. The man, Morris, ordered a whiskey and started a quiet talk with Harlan, his voice too low for Owen to hear from where they sat. "We have to leave right now," Victoria whispered, her voice shaking. "If he recognizes you in this awful weather, we would not make it 5 miles," Owen answered quietly. "I reckon our best bet is to just lay low, get to our room, and be long gone by sunup before he's even awake." You could feel the fear coming off Victoria, but she gave a little nod, putting her trust in his plan. They hurried through the rest of their supper, then made their way on up the stairs, careful not to even glance over toward Morris's table. But Owen could feel that man's eyes boring into their backs as they climbed the stairs. He was not about to give him the satisfaction of letting on that he even saw him. Their room was small, but it was tidy, with 2 narrow beds separated by a small nightstand. A single window looked out on the dark, rain-soaked landscape, and a simple washstand sat in the corner, holding a pitcher full of water and a wash basin. The second that door clicked shut behind them, Victoria started pacing like a caged animal. He had to have recognized me, Owen. And if he did not, he surely noticed a woman traveling with a man, and that got him mighty suspicious. Now hold on, Owen reasoned. Even if he did, he cannot be 100% certain it is you, and he can't do a single thing with this storm raging outside. But Victoria was not consoled. "You do not know these kinds of people, Owen. The porters, they have eyes and ears everywhere. Their money buys them all the loyalty they need, and they have plenty of it." Owen moved to her side, speaking gently, taking her by the shoulders to halt her pacing. "Victoria, look at me." When she did, he continued, "We're going to be fine. Tomorrow we'll be back on the trail before dawn, and by nightfall we'll reach my uncle's place where no one will find us." Victoria searched his face, seeking reassurance. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Owen insisted. "We just need to get through tonight." A knock at the door startled them both. Victoria's eyes widened in alarm, but Owen motioned for her to stay calm. "Who is it?" he called. "Harlan," came the reply. "Got some extra blankets. Gets cold up here at night." Owen moved to the door, opening it just enough to take the offered blankets. "Thank you." Harlan nodded, his good eye darting briefly past Owen to Victoria before he turned away. Owen closed and locked the door, an uneasy feeling settling in his gut. Something about Harlan's manner had changed. "He knows," Victoria said, voicing Owen's own suspicion. "Or at least he suspects." Owen set the blankets down. "Maybe, but Harlan's not one to get involved in other people's business, not unless there is a pretty penny in it for him." What he was saying hung heavy in the room. If Morris was putting up some kind of reward money, Harlan might just be tempted to lend him a hand. "We need to get out of here right now," Victoria insisted. "Storm or no storm?" Owen walked over to the window, staring out at that sideways rain and the wind howling something fierce. "That is a surefire way to get lost, or a whole lot worse. We would just be putting ourselves in deeper trouble, not getting out of it." Victoria just sank down onto one of the beds, the fight seeming to drain right out of her shoulders. "So what are we supposed to do then?" Owen sat down right beside her, so close that their shoulders were touching. "We will take turns keeping watch. You get some rest when you are able, and we will leave the second this storm lets up, even if it is the dead of night." Victoria just nodded, leaning a little into his steady presence. "I am so sorry for bringing all this trouble right to your doorstep, Owen." "Do not be," he replied. His voice was quiet but firm. "Because I am not." Victoria looked up at him with clear surprise in her eyes. "How in the world can you say that? You have had to leave your own home. You are in danger all because of me." Owen reached up, gently brushing a stray piece of hair from her face in a way that was more personal than anything they had ever shared before. "Because meeting you has been a real eye-opener for me, Victoria. For so many years, I have just been walking through life, not really living it. You came along and reminded me what it feels like to truly care about something, about someone, deeply all over again." Victoria felt her breath catch in her throat at his honest words. For what felt like a lifetime, they just stood there looking right at each other, and the air between them was thick with unspoken feelings. Then, with a burst of courage that took even her by surprise, Victoria closed the small distance between them and gently pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft and sweet at first, a little shy, almost asking a question. But when Owen wrapped his strong arms around her, pulling her in close, it deepened into something powerful, filled with a desperate longing. It was a kiss that held all their fears and all their hopes, all their worries and the brand new trust they had found. When they finally pulled away to catch their breath, Owen rested his forehead right against hers. I have been wanting to do that since the very first moment I saw you smile at old Duchess, he admitted softly. A gentle laugh escaped Victoria, a sound full of surprise and pure happiness. Well, I have been hoping you would do that since you offered me a safe place to stay without asking for a single thing in return. Owen's warm smile softened just a little as he pulled back to look her right in the eyes. Victoria, when all this trouble is finally over, when you are safe, I need you to know something. You don't owe me a single thing. Not your heart, not your future. Just because I helped you out, that doesn't mean anything. Victoria hushed him with a gentle finger to his lips. I know that, Owen. What I am feeling for you has nothing to do with being grateful. It has everything to do with the good man you are. Her eyes searched his. Do you believe me? Owen nodded, then turned to press a warm kiss into her palm. I do. Then they settled in for a long, watchful night, taking turns to get some rest while the other one kept a careful watch. The storm raged on without letting up, with rain lashing against the window and a mean wind howling around the edges of the old building. But despite all that was happening, there was a new kind of calm between them, a quiet understanding that whatever was coming next, they were going to face it as one. Around 3 in the morning, as Owen sat by the window keeping his watch, the heavy rain finally started to ease up. By 4, it had stopped altogether, though thick, dark clouds still covered up the moon and the stars. Victoria, he whispered, gently shaking her awake. The storm has passed. I reckon we should get going. She was wide awake in an instant. All those years of being cautious had trained her to wake up at a moment's notice, in a low whisper. You hearing anything moving around downstairs? Not a peep, Owen answered, already grabbing what little they had. But there is no sense in pushing our luck. They moved like shadows in the dark, getting ready to make a run for it. The whole trading post was still as a tomb, most folks still lost in their dreams in that dark before the dawn. Owen gently turned the knob, easing the door open. He flinched at the small groan from the old wooden hinges and took a long look down the hallway. All clear. They tiptoed down the stairs, stepping right over the boards they knew would cry out if you put any weight on them. Down in the main room of that old trading post, it was empty except for Harlan. He was slumped in a chair right there behind the counter, with a heavy shotgun laid right across his lap. The back door, Owen mouthed, pointing his chin over toward the kitchen. They were almost there, almost home free, when a floorboard let out a loud squeal right under Victoria's boot. They both froze solid, their eyes locked on Harlan, who shifted in his sleep but, thank the heavens, did not wake up. After a heart-stopping moment, they started their slow crawl again, finally slipping into the kitchen and right out the back door. That night air hit them, all cool and damp from the storm that had passed, and the ground was all soft and muddy underneath their worn-out boots. Owen led them on over to the stable where their horses had been kept safe for the night. He let out a quiet breath of relief, seeing all 4 of their animals were standing there and looked to be well taken care of. Go on and saddle Duchess, Owen said in a low voice. I'll get the others ready to ride. They moved quick and sure in the dim light, only speaking when they absolutely had to. Before you knew it, all 4 of the horses were saddled up and their gear was tied down tight. Owen was just giving Victoria a hand up onto her horse when a voice cut through the quiet from the stable doorway. Y'all going somewhere. They both spun around and saw Morris standing right there, a pistol held firm in his hand, aimed straight at the 2 of them. And right behind him stood Harlan, big as a barn door, with his shotgun at the ready. You best step away from the lady, mister, Morris said, his voice smooth as silk but cold as a stone. Me and Miss Thornton here have some unfinished business to sort out. But Owen, he didn't budge an inch, keeping his body planted like a shield right out between Victoria and that pistol. This lady ain't going anywhere she doesn't want to, Owen said firmly. Morris just smiled, a nasty little grin. Well, I'm afraid that's not your decision to be making. See, Mr. Porter is mighty eager to have his fiancée come on back home, right where she belongs. I am not his fiancée, Victoria said, and her voice was steady, even though Owen could feel the fear coming off her. Feeling just pouring off of her. And this here ain't your home. Morris let out a big sigh, like he was dealing with a child who just would not listen. Now, Miss Thornton, you and I both know your daddy's debts are not just going to disappear. Mr. Porter has been mighty patient, but even his generosity has its limits. There are no debts, Victoria snapped right back at him. My father never borrowed a single red cent from the Porters. They cooked up those papers right after he passed just to try and force me into marrying Randall. Morris's face went cold and hard as a rock. Those are some mighty dangerous words, Miss Thornton. I would suggest you watch what you say. Or what? Owen challenged. You gonna get rough with us? That would be a mighty tough story to tell the local sheriff. Now, would it not? Accidents happen all the time out in these parts, Harlan chimed in, giving his shotgun a little friendly pat, especially to folks who are not familiar with the lay of the land. Owen's mind was turning fast, weighing all their options. Duchess was still standing right between him and Victoria, giving them a little bit of cover. Thunder was just over his shoulder, already saddled up, if they could just make some kind of distraction. So how much is Porter paying y'all for this? Owen asked Harlan, just trying to buy a little time. Plenty, the older man replied with a shrug of his shoulders. More than you could ever hope to match, Newcomb. Well, now, I would not be so certain about that, Owen countered. I have got some money put aside. And land, too. So what is your price? Morris just scoffed at him. Do not you even bother trying to buy your way out of this here fix. Harlan knows a whole lot better than to cross the Porters. He gestured with the pistol in his hand. Now then, Miss Thornton, if you would be so kind as to come with me, your intended is getting mighty worried about you. Victoria's hand quickly found its way to Owen's arm, squeezing it with a desperate plea. He understood. The silent message. She was not going back. At least, not while she was still drawing breath. I do believe there has been a misunderstanding, Owen said in a slow drawl, shifting his weight ever so slightly. You seem to be under the impression that we are giving you some kind of a choice in this matter. Before Morris could even think to answer, Owen let out a piercingly sharp whistle. It cut right through the quiet air. Thunder, trained for that exact signal, reared up violently on his hind legs, creating an immediate distraction. In that very same motion, Owen hoisted Victoria right up onto Duchess's back and slapped the horse's flank good and hard. Rid! He hollered at the top of his lungs. Duchess bolted forward like a lightning strike, nearly trampling Morris, who had to dive clear out of the way with a curse. Curse. Heron let out a nasty curse and leveled his shotgun. But Owen was already moving like a blur, swinging himself up onto Thunder's back just as the big horse's hooves hit the dirt from its powerful rear. A shot exploded through the night, the bullet whistling a hair's breadth past Owen's ear as he urged Thunder to chase after Duchess. More shots rang out, but they were already plunging deep into the inky blackness, leaving that miserable trading post far behind them. They rode like their lives depended on it, following a winding creek bed that would swallow up their tracks. The pack horses, good and steady, followed right along, trained to stick close to the lead animals no matter what. When they finally dared to slow down, after nearly an hour of that heart-pounding ride, Victoria was shaking all over. Are you hurt? Owen asked, his voice tight with worry as he rode up beside her. Victoria just shook her head, her knuckles bone white where she gripped the reins. No, are you? I am fine, Owen promised her, even though his own heart was still hammering like a drum from their terribly close escape. But they are going to come after us. We have got to keep moving forward. Victoria nodded, her face hardening with a new determination. How much farther is it to your uncle's place? If we really push ourselves, we can get there by sunset tomorrow, Owen replied, doing the math in his head. It is some rough country up ahead, but I reckon that actually works in our favor. It will be harder to track us. They rode on through the long day, stopping just long enough to let the horses catch their breath and have a bite to eat. Just some cold grub they had packed in their saddlebags. The land started getting meaner and rougher the farther they went, pushing on toward that border country. They were leaving the wide open plains behind for some real rocky hills all dotted with scrubby pines and tough old juniper trees. Owen, he knew the way, leading them down deer trails and through dry creek beds, picking out paths on purpose that'd be a real chore for anyone to track. Well, by late in the afternoon, they had not seen a soul, no sign of anyone following, but Owen, he kept his eyes peeled. He figured a fellow like Morris was not the kind to just give up and go home, not with whatever kind of reward money those porters were putting up. Right there, Owen finally said, pointing up ahead to a skinny little canyon cut into the rock. My Uncle Samuel's place is just on the other side of that ridge. Victoria had to squint with the sun getting low in the sky. It is certainly tucked away, she said. Well, that is kind of the point, Owen answered with a little grin. Uncle Samuel, he sure does value his privacy, almost as much as he loves those wild Mustangs of his. So they threaded their way on through that canyon, and it opened up into a small valley, all sheltered and hidden. A good solid log cabin was tucked up against one wall of the canyon, nearly covered up by a stand of big old cottonwood trees. A corral and a little barn were there, making up the whole homestead. But as they rode closer, Owen started noticing things. That this place was not nearly as abandoned as he had expected. The corral held a few horses, and a wisp of smoke curled from the cabin's chimney. Well now, someone's home, he said, pulling Thunder to a halt. Stay right behind me. But before Victoria could answer, the cabin door swung open, and a figure appeared. A tall, lanky man with silver hair and a kind, weathered face that broke into a wide, familiar smile. Well, I'll be Owen Newcomb, as I live and breathe, the man called out. It is about time you came to see about what is yours. Owen felt his shoulders relax, and he smiled right back. Marcus, I thought you had moved on to Colorado. I tried that, the older man replied, walking over to welcome them. It was way too cold for these old bones. I figured you would not mind if I kept an eye on the place for you. His gaze then shifted to Victoria, his eyes full of friendly curiosity. And who might this fine lady be? This is Victoria Thornton, Owen replied, swinging down from his horse and helping Victoria off of Duchess. Victoria, this is Marcus Webb, my uncle's oldest and dearest friend, and the best horseman you will find west of the Mississippi. Marcus tipped his hat politely. Ma'am, any friend of Owen's is always welcome here. Owen's face turned hard as a stone. We are in a heap of trouble, Marcus. There are men following us. I counted at least 2, but there could be a whole lot more by now. And they are fixing to bring harm to Victoria. The old man's eyes narrowed to little slits, but he did not waste a single breath on questions. Well then, let us get you both inside that door and get those horses tucked away out of sight. We can hash out all the details over a good supper. The inside of the cabin was simple, but it was mighty comfortable. It had a big stone fireplace, strong wooden furniture, and walls that were just lined with books. That was Samuel Newcomb's passion, right alongside his love for horses. Marcus had kept the whole place clean and in fine shape, a fact that Owen appreciated more than he could say. They sat down to a dinner of venison stew and warm cornbread, and Owen explained everything. He did not leave a single thing out. Marcus listened without saying a word, his weathered face looking mighty grim. Porters, he finally said, right after Owen had finished his story. A banking family out of Missouri. I had some dealings with them folks years ago. They are hard people, especially the old man. Victoria nodded her head. That is them. Randall is the son. He was the man I was once engaged to marry. Marcus studied her for a long moment. A thoughtful look settled on his face. And they went through all this trouble, sending men all the way across state lines just to find you, to haul you back for a wedding. Victoria's hands were twisting together in her lap. There is much more to this story. You see, my father was the bank's head accountant. Right before he passed on, he discovered some strange things in the ledgers, real evidence that the porters were stealing money from their own customers. I am certain they had him silenced to keep him quiet, and then they tried to use me to make sure any proof he might have left behind would never see the light of day. Owen just stared at her, completely stunned. You never told me any of this before, because I cannot prove it, Victoria answered, and you could hear the pain in her voice. I found some notes in my daddy's papers after he was gone, but there was nothing solid enough to bring to the law. And that is when the porters announced my father's supposed debts and made their little proposition. I knew right then that they were terrified of what I might uncover if I started digging around. Marcus let out a low whistle. Well now, that changes everything. They are not going to stop looking for you, not when you are a danger to their entire operation. Which is exactly why we need to end this, Owen said with resolve. We cannot just run and hide. Victoria looked at him, her eyes wide with alarm. What are you thinking? We need that proof, Owen answered. Something real solid we can take to the federal marshals, not just the local lawmen that the porters have in their pocket. Marcus gave a slow nod. That makes a whole lot of sense. But how in the world do you reckon we get that kind of proof when it is all the way back in Missouri? Owen stroked his jaw, deep in thought. Well, now maybe it is not all back in Missouri. Victoria, did your father happen to keep any copies of his ledgers? Anything at all he might have hidden away? Victoria's eyes shot wide open. There was a box, his strong box. I could not get it open before I had to run. I left it buried down deep, under the rose bush in our garden in Willow Creek. Well then, that is exactly where we need to go, Owen said, his mind made up. You cannot possibly be serious, Victoria protested. Willow Creek is the very first place they will be looking for me. Which is exactly why we need a good plan, Owen replied. And some help, he said, turning to Marcus. I hate to ask, but the older man just waved him off. Don't you even start that talk. Samuel would have my hide if I did not help his own nephew. Besides, he added with a sparkle in his eye, I have never had much use for bankers. They stayed up late, well into the night, hammering out every detail of their plan. Marcus knew good people all across the territories who could help. Men who owed him big, some former rangers, even a few lawmen. And then there were the others, the kind of fellows whose work you just do not talk about in a decent home. Just give me 2 weeks, the old trainer promised, and I can have a web of eyes and ears spun up from here clear to Missouri. We can get messages through and keep a close watch on every move Porter's men make. Owen gave a firm nod. In the meantime, Victoria and I will hunker down right here and stay clear out of sight. If Morris and Harlan are still sniffing around on our trail, well, this valley is a good place to make a stand. Marcus agreed. I'll be riding out just as soon as the sun comes up. I have a friend down in Santa Fe who can get our telegrams sent out. No questions asked. Then we'll start getting all the pieces of this puzzle set right. That very night, Owen and Victoria found themselves sharing the cabin's other little bedroom. The ever-present threat of being hunted down had done away with any silly notions about what was proper and what was not. As they lay there in the deep darkness, it was Victoria's soft voice that finally cut through the quiet. Are you absolutely sure about all this, Owen? It is not too late to just turn around and walk away. This is not your fight. Owen shifted in the dark to face her, even though he could barely make out the shape of her face in the pitch-black room. It became my fight the very second you walked into my life, Victoria. And you know, even if it had not, what those Porter men are doing is just plain wrong. And somebody has got to be the one to stop them. Victoria's hands searched for his under the blankets. I'm scared, she admitted in a quiet voice. Not just for me, but for you. For what might happen if this all goes wrong. Owen gave her fingers a gentle squeeze. We are not going to fail. And even if things get a little sideways, we will face it together. That is what really matters. Victoria snuggled closer, resting her head right there on his shoulder. When did you get to be so important to me? She asked out loud. Just a few weeks ago, you were a complete stranger. Owen wrapped his arm around her, pulling her in tight. Life has a funny way of giving us exactly what we need, right when we need it most. Victoria tilted her face up to his, finding his lips in the quiet darkness. This was nothing like their first kiss. This one had no desperation, only a slow and steady certainty. When they finally pulled apart, Owen knew with a powerful clarity that whatever was coming next, there was absolutely no turning back now. His future was forever tied to Victoria's. Get some sleep, he murmured against her hair. Tomorrow we start to fight back, for real. The next 2 weeks passed by in a whirlwind of getting ready and just waiting. Marcus rode out just as he promised, returning every so often to get news and round up supplies. Owen kept busy, fixing up the old cabin and patching up the corral, while Victoria was tending to the little garden patch that had grown a bit wild in all the years since Samuel had passed on. When evening came, they'd sit down and plot, making their plans, huddled over old maps and talking through every last detail of their next move. But it was not all business. There were quiet moments too. They shared simple meals and took long walks down in the valley and spent their nights holding each other close. Even with all the danger hanging over them, or maybe because of it, the bond between them just kept getting deeper, growing from that first spark into something a whole lot more real and true. You know, I have been thinking, Owen said one evening as they sat out on the cabin's porch, just watching the sunset paint those canyon walls. When all this is over, and when you are really and truly free, what is it you want to do? Victoria thought on that question for a moment. I honestly have not let myself think that far down the road. For the longest time, it has just been about getting through the next day and then the next week. Owen just nodded. He understood completely. But if you could choose anything, with no fear and nobody to answer to, what would you want your life to look like? Victoria's eyes drifted out toward the horizon. I'd want a real home, not just four walls and a roof, but a place where you feel safe and sound. I'd want to do work that means something, maybe teaching, like I always planned to before my daddy passed away. She took a breath, her voice getting real soft, and I'd want somebody to share it all with, someone good-hearted and brave and honest. Owen's heart started to beat a little faster at her words. Someone like me, he asked, though he was only half joking about it. Victoria turned to face him, and her expression got real serious. Not someone like you, Owen. You, if you'll still have me when this is all said and done. Owen gently took her hand and brought it up to his lips. Victoria Thornton, I would have you right now, tomorrow, and every single day after that. But I reckon we ought to deal with Porter first, before we start planning any wedding. Victoria let out a laugh, and the sound bounced off the canyon walls. Now that's a practical way of thinking. I approve. But their happy moment was cut short by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They both tensed up right until they recognized Marcus's familiar old whistle. The old trainer came riding into the yard, and his face was grim. Got news from Amarillo, he called out as he swung down from his horse. Porter himself just rode into town with about half a dozen hired guns. They're turning the whole place upside down. Apart, been looking for you too. Owen gently helped Victoria stand up, his mind already turning over their next move. Backup plans. How close are we with our preparations back in Missouri? We're just about set, Marcus answered, stepping inside the little cabin. I got word today. Our folks are all in place back in Willow Creek. Porter left that boy of his in charge, but I hear the security around their place has been beefed up. The color drained from Victoria's face. So they're expecting us to come back. Marcus just shrugged his shoulders. It's hard to say for sure now. Could just be them being extra careful. But the good news is, with Porter all the way out here, he is not there. And my man in town tells me the federal bank examiner is scheduled to hit Willow Creek in about 3 weeks for one of their regular inspections. A spark of understanding lit up in Owen's eyes. That is perfect timing. If we can just get your father's evidence into that examiner's hands, the Porters will be done for. Victoria finished his thought, but we have to move fast, real fast, before Randall gets wind of what we're fixing to do. They stayed up all night, hashing out every last detail. By the time the sun came up, their path was clear. Owen and Victoria were to travel to Willow Creek on their own, taking completely different roads to make sure they were not followed. Marcus, bless his heart, was staying behind to lay down a false trail for Porter and his whole crew to follow, leading them on a real wild goose chase all across the territories. As the sun started to break, Owen and Victoria got themselves ready for their own long journey. They were fixing to be apart for nearly 2 whole weeks. Victoria would be traveling by train, while Owen took to his horse, sticking to the roads less traveled. I sure don't like the thought of you out there all alone, Owen confessed as he gave Victoria a hand up onto her fresh horse. She was set to ride to the nearest town that had a train depot, and then she would continue her long journey by rail, pretending to be a widow heading back home. I'll be just fine, Victoria told him, though her own heart was aching at the thought of them separating. Besides, we'll draw a whole lot less attention this way. Ain't nobody looking for a single widow on a train. Owen reached out and adjusted her hat, using the moment as an excuse to feel her touch one last time. You be careful now. If anything seems the least bit wrong, anything at all, I'll drop this plan and I'll meet you right at our fallback spot." Victoria finished his thought for him. "I remember." Owen nodded, taking a slow step back like he hated to. 2 weeks. We'll meet up at Widow Jensen's boarding house over in Willow Creek." Victoria gave him the bravest smile she could. 2 weeks, not a single day more. Day longer. With one last look back, she turned her horse around and rode on out, following that narrow trail that led out of the canyon. Owen watched her until she completely disappeared from his view. Then he turned to his own business. They had finally set their plan in motion. Now all they could do was have faith in each other and in the whole network of allies Marcus had pulled together. The journey to Willow Creek was a long one, and it was filled with tension. Owen traveled by the dark of night when he could, staying clear of the main roads and towns. He crossed on over into Kansas without a lick of trouble, but as he got closer to Missouri, he had to be a whole lot more cautious. You see, Porter's influence just grew stronger the closer he got to Willow Creek. Just 2 days before their planned meeting, Owen made it to the outskirts of town. He set up his camp in a hidden little grove of trees on the property of a farmer who was on their side, one of Marcus's many good contacts. "That Porter fella has his men watching all the roads into town," the farmer, a weathered old man named Jenkins, let him know. "But your lady friend, she got here safe about 3 days back. She's been staying over at the widow's place, just as planned." Planned, nobody has given her a second look. So far, so good. Owen felt a great sense of relief. "And that bank examiner is still coming next Tuesday, right?" Jenkins confirmed. "The whole town is buzzing about it. It seems the Porters are getting mighty nervous. They have been working late at the bank every single night." A grim smile appeared on Owen's face. "Good. That means they still have not found whatever it is that Victoria's father hid from them." "Speaking of hiding," Jenkins said, "you best keep your head down until the time is right. Randall Porter is offering a pretty big reward for any information about strangers asking a lot of questions." Owen slowly nodded his head. He understood the situation completely. For the next 2 days, he stayed close to the camp, only going out after dark to scout the town and get to know the lay of the land. Willow Creek was a lot smaller than he had imagined. Just one main street with the bank, a hotel, and a few other businesses, all surrounded by quiet little streets lined with well-kept homes. The Porter mansion sat high on a hill, looking down over the town, a flashy show of money compared to all the more humble houses below. Even from that far away, Owen could see guards walking around the property. Whatever evidence Victoria's father had hidden, the Porters were not about to let their secrets get out. They were making sure of it. On the evening before their secret meeting, Owen moved as quiet as a church mouse to Widow Jensen's boarding house, a tidy 2-story building on a peaceful side street. Just as they had planned, he gave a signal, tapping 3 quick times on the back door. The door opened in a heartbeat, and Victoria was standing right there, her face just shining with joy and pure relief. She wore a plain dark dress, and her hair was tucked under a widow's mom. But to Owen, she had never looked so wonderful. "You made it," she whispered, pulling him inside the doorway and into a warm embrace. Owen held on to her for dear life, burying his face in her neck and breathing in the familiar sweet smell of her. "I've missed you so much," he murmured against her skin. Victoria leaned back just enough to press her lips to his in a long, heartfelt kiss. "I was so scared. Every single day I expected to hear that you had been found." "I am a little harder to catch than that," Owen promised her with a small smile. "Now tell me everything you know. What have you found out?" They quietly moved into a little sitting room at the very back of the house, where the widow Jensen, a woman in her 60s with eyes as sharp as a hawk's, looked like she knew exactly which way the wind was blowing, served them some tea, and then, quiet as a mouse, she slipped out of the room. "I found it," Victoria began. "I found my old home. It's been sold, but it's just sitting empty between renters. The garden is all wild and overgrown, but the rose bush is still standing. I am absolutely certain that is where my daddy hid his strongbox." "Any guards?" Owen asked, his voice low. "Not a one that I could spot. The Porters do not seem to be paying it any mind." But then Victoria's face clouded over with worry. "But they are keeping a close eye on the bank examiner. He showed up early. He is staying at the hotel now, and Randall has been all over him, trying to sweet-talk him, I reckon, before the real inspection even starts." Owen frowned. Well, that just throws a wrench in the works. We need to get to that examiner before Randall gets the man completely in his pocket. Victoria gave a firm nod. I've been asking around. He eats his supper alone at the hotel restaurant every single evening. I was thinking I might just walk up to him right there. Tell him I have some information about the bank. That is way too risky, Owen countered. Randall could spot you a mile away, disguise or not. Let me be the one to do it, Victoria. Owen had been thinking about that very thing. Maybe so, but first things first, we need that strong box. We cannot go around making claims without any real proof. Tonight then, Owen decided right there. We are going to get it tonight while the whole town is sound asleep. With their plans set, they spent the last few hours of daylight going over every single detail. The kind widow Jensen had sketched them a little map of the town, marking exactly which streets the sheriff's men patrolled the most and which ones offered the deepest shadows. By the time night fell, they were ready. Dressed in dark clothes from head to toe, they slipped out the back door of the boarding house just a little after the midnight hour. The town was quiet as a tomb, most windows were dark, though you could still see a faint light from the saloon way down at the end of Main Street. They kept to the shadows, moving fast but being careful not to make a sound through all the back alleys and private gardens. Victoria's old house stood on a corner lot, its windows dark and shut up tight. The garden she once loved so much, her pride and joy, had turned into a sad tangle of weeds and wild bushes. There, Victoria whispered, her voice trembling. She pointed to a big, overgrown rose bush near the back fence. That is where he would have hidden it. Owen kept a sharp lookout while Victoria knelt down beside the bush, using it with the little garden trowel they had brought along. The ground was hard as a rock, but she kept on working, digging methodically right around the base of the plant, where no one would ever notice the disturbed dirt. After a few minutes that felt like a lifetime, her trowel finally hit something solid with a clink. Victoria's heart jumped. I've got it. Together they dug out a small metal box, dark and stained from its time in the earth, but it was still solid. And just as she had figured, it was locked up tight. We'll get it open back at the boarding house, Owen whispered, sliding the old box into a sack. Let's get out of here before someone sees us. They had almost made it to the back gate when a sharp voice called out from the street. Who's over there? You're on private property, called the town watchman, who was making his rounds. Owen gave Victoria a gentle push toward the shadows. Go on now, I'll take care of this. Before she could even whisper a protest, Owen stepped out into the open, faking a clumsy drunken walk. Well, howdy, officer, he called, making his voice sound all thick and slurred. It's a fine night for a walk, is it not? The watchman came closer, holding his lantern up high. You are trespassing, mister. This here house is vacant. Owen just leaned against the fence, really playing the part. Is that a fact? Well, I could have sworn this was the old Sullivan place, belonging to old Jim. Sullivan invited me over for a drink. Well now, Sullivan lives about 3 streets over, the watchman said, getting a bit impatient. You had best be on your way before I decide to haul you in for the night. Owen just nodded agreeably. Well, you're right about that, my mistake completely. He pushed himself off from the fence, making sure to stumble a little. I reckon I'll just head on over to Jim's place then. Sorry for the trouble. The watchman kept a close eye on him, looking suspicious, but he did not make a move to stop him. Owen wandered off in the direction the man pointed, making sure to keep up his drunken act until he was good and out of sight. Then, moving with a real purpose, he circled back around toward their meeting spot behind the church. Victoria was waiting there, clutching the sack tightly in her hands. That was way too close, she whispered, as they started walking side by side. But it worked, Owen pointed out, nodding toward the sack. Let's get on back before anyone else gets curious about folks taking a late-night stroll. They made it back to the boarding house without any more trouble. Safe and sound in Victoria's room, they finally looked over their prize. The strong box was small but built solid, with a combination lock, keeping whatever was inside safe and sound. You reckon you know the combination? Owen asked, as Victoria turned that old box over in her hands. I believe I do, she replied, her voice soft. My daddy used dates that meant something to him for just about everything. She carefully began to rotate the dials. My mama's birthday, then my birthday, and the day he asked her to marry him. With a soft click, the lock sprang open. Inside, they found a few leather-bound ledgers, a small packet of letters, and a stack of other documents, all of them bearing the official Porter Bank seal. Victoria's hands trembled something fierce as she opened the very first ledger. These, these are copies of the bank's transaction records, she whispered, her eyes scanning the neat columns of figures. And look here, she pointed to little notes written in the margins, in a different handwriting. These are my father's notes, pointing out things that just did not add up. Owen leaned in closer, studying the old pages. Can you make heads or tails of it all? Victoria nodded her head slowly. I worked at that bank for a short while right before my father died. These entries, they show money being moved out of the regular customer accounts and into the porter's own private accounts. Just small amounts from each account, not enough that the customers would ever notice. But it was all adding up to thousands over time. This is embezzlement. Owen confirmed, his voice low. This is enough to send them to the penitentiary. It is more than enough, Victoria replied, carefully turning another brittle page. And there is even more. There were letters from customers, good people, asking questions about their account balances. There was also correspondence between her father and the senior porter about some very serious accounting irregularities. My father was building a solid case against them, and they took his life for it, Owen said with a grim certainty. Victoria, this is exactly what we have been searching for. With this mountain of evidence, the bank examiner can bring federal charges down hard on the porters. Victoria gently put the precious documents back inside the box. We have to be mighty careful how we approach him. If the porters catch wind of what we are doing before he gets to see this proof, then we will do it first thing in the morning, Owen decided firmly, before they have any idea we are even in town. They spent the rest of that long night going over every single paper, organizing the most powerful evidence, and getting their story straight for the bank examiner. By the time the sun rose, they were ready. The hotel dining room was almost empty when they walked in the next morning. The bank examiner, a thin man who looked like a school teacher, with his spectacles perched on his nose, was sitting alone at a table. Corner table looking over some papers while he was eating. Owen walked up first, with Victoria just a step behind him. He said, Mr. Hawkins, my name's Owen Newcomb. And this here is Victoria Thornton, and we need to have a word with you about some mighty urgent business at the bank. Hawkins finally looked up, and you could see he was not one bit pleased. I don't talk shop while I'm having my breakfast, son, he said flatly. If you've got a problem with the Porter Bank, I suggest you go and make an appointment the right way, through the proper channels. That's when Victoria stepped forward, keeping her voice real low. Mr. Hawkins, sir, I'm the daughter of Edward Thornton. He was the chief accountant down at the Porter Bank, right up until he died last year. We have proof that there's been some serious and systematic stealing going on by the Porter family. The same proof my father was putting together right when he was murdered. Well, that sure got Hawkins' attention. He gave Victoria a long, hard look. Miss Thornton, he said, I was under the impression you'd left town months ago. I was forced to run for my life, Victoria shot back, after Randall Porter tried to shut me up for good by using threats and getting rough. Hawkins' eyes darted around the dining room, all of a sudden looking real cautious. This is a serious accusation. I cannot simply take your word for it on something this serious. Owen placed the heavy lockbox right on the table. We are not asking you to do that. We have the paperwork, the account records, every letter sent, and even my father's own notes spelling out the entire crooked scheme. All we are asking is that you look over the proof with your own eyes before you begin your official examination. Hawkins paused for a long moment, clearly caught between his professional caution and a powerful curiosity. At last, he gave a slow nod. All right then, my room in 10 minutes. We will not be interrupted in there. Owen and Victoria shared a look of pure relief. They had cleared the first big hurdle. Inside Hawkins' room, they laid out every piece of evidence in perfect order. The examiner looked over the documents, his face showing more and more concern, asking sharp, intelligent questions that Victoria answered with total confidence. Well now, this is mighty troubling, Hawkins said finally, taking off his spectacles to polish the lenses. If this is all proven true, and I must prove every last bit of it, you understand this represents a massive violation of banking regulations and the criminal law. We understand that completely. Owen assured him. All we are asking for is a thorough and fair investigation and some real protection. Victoria then added, the porters are going to know exactly where this information came from. Lord knows they have already tried to shut me up for good once before. Hawkins gave a serious nod. I will be sending a wire to my superiors right away. We can get some federal marshals down here in just a few days to lock down that bank and all its paperwork. He turned and looked at Victoria, and his eyes were full of real sympathy. Miss Thornton, I am truly sorry for what you have lost. Your father, well, he sounds like he was a man of real principle. A sad smile touched Victoria's lips. He surely was. All I am asking for is justice for him and for every last soul the porters have robbed blind. And I promise you, justice is what you will get, Hawkins vowed, his voice firm. Now, in the meantime, I think it is best you two lay low and stay out of sight. If what you are saying about the porters is the gospel truth, they will not think twice about coming after you if they get wind that you are back in town. So Owen and Victoria made their way back to the boarding house, with a powerful mix of relief and worry churning deep inside them. They had kicked a hornet's nest, and there was no turning back now. The investigation into the Porter family was going to move forward, no matter what happened to the two of them. But that also meant they were more exposed than ever before, stuck in a town run by their enemies, just waiting for what came next. All they could do was wait for the federal lawmen to arrive. We ought to leave this town, Owen suggested, as they sat in Victoria's room, speaking in low voices. Now that Hawkins has the proof he needs, he said, there is no good reason for us to be here. We could be halfway to Kansas by nightfall. But Victoria just shook her head, her mind set. No, I have to see this through to the very end. After everything my daddy went through, and everything I have endured, I want to see the look on their faces when they are finally arrested. Owen understood that she needed to see justice served, but that did not stop him from worrying. All right then, we will stay hidden until the marshals get here. No taking any foolish chances. They kept up their watch for 2 long and tense days. Hawkins managed to get a message to them through the widow Jensen, telling them the federal marshals were set to arrive on the train that Friday. Until then, he was just going about his business, doing his examination as if nothing was wrong, all the while gathering up even more evidence from right inside the bank itself. On Thursday evening, the little bit of peace they had found was suddenly shattered. Owen was coming back from a quick scout around the town when he noticed 2 men he did not recognize, watching the boarding house from the other side of the street. The way they stood, so still and watchful, marked them as hired guns, not just a couple of fellas passing the time. He slipped around back, coming in through the same way as before, and hurried right on up to Victoria's room. They found us, he said, not wasting a single second. Porter's got his men watching the whole house. Victoria's face went pale, but she kept her nerve steady. How? We were so careful about everything. It doesn't matter now, Owen shot back, already pulling together their most important belongings. We have to move right now before they get the idea to come busting in here after us. The widow Jensen appeared in the doorway. Her face, which was usually so calm, was all creased up with worry. There are more of them out at the front now. 4 men, and every one of them is armed. Owen's mind was spinning, trying to figure a way out. The boarding house only had 2 ways to get out, and now both of them were being watched. They were good and truly trapped. Is there a way up to the roof? He asked the widow. She gave a nod. A trap door in the upstairs hall leads right up to the flat part of the roof in the building right next door. Owen pushed on. How close are we talking? It's the hat maker's shop. The roof's almost touch around the back, Mrs. Jensen told him, and you could see the idea dawning in her eyes. But that's a mighty dangerous jump, especially when it's dark out. Owen turned and looked right at Victoria. It's our best shot. We'll cross over to the hat shop, then head down right through that building and out the back door. From there, it's a straight shot to the stables where I've got Thunder waiting for us. Victoria just nodded, trusting him completely. You lead the way. Mrs. Jensen was set on creating a bit of a distraction. I will tell them you settled up your bill and took off this morning, she said, her voice firm. That ought to buy you all some time while they try to figure out which way you went. Owen took the older woman's hand full of gratitude. We just cannot thank you enough for every single thing you have done. Mrs. Jensen waved them on toward the hallway. You can thank me by staying alive. Now get. The trapdoor was mighty stiff, but it opened with a good firm push. Owen scrambled through first, and then he helped Victoria up onto the roof. The night sky was clear, and the stars gave just enough light to see their way across the flat stretch of tar and gravel. At the far end of the building, they found the gap between the boarding house and the hatmaker's shop. It was a narrow thing, maybe 3 feet wide, but it was enough to make you hesitate, especially with a 15-foot drop down to the dark alley below. I will go on first, Owen said. Then I can give you a hand to get across. Victoria squeezed his arm tight. Easy now, Owen whispered, backing up a few paces. He took a deep breath of the cool night air, and then he ran. The man cleared that gap with plenty of room to spare, landing with a soft thud on the shingles of the next building. He turned right around, waving his hand, urging Victoria to follow his lead. She started to copy him, backing up slow and steady to get herself a good running start. But just as she was fixing to jump, she heard voices rise up from the dark alleyway down below. Go check the roof. I'll bet Jensen's still laying up there somewhere. Victoria froze up solid, paralyzed for just a second by the cold, hard fact that they had finally been discovered. Owen waved his arms frantically for her to jump anyway, but that moment she paused cost her dearly. A shot cracked through the silence, the bullet striking the rooftop not 2 feet from where she stood. Victoria, now! So Owen hollered, reaching his hand out across that dark, empty space. She ran, pure fear giving her speed. And just as she leaped, another shot rang out. Owen watched in horror as she faltered in midair, her body twisting in a way it was never meant to. She slammed into the very edge of the milliner's roof, her fingers scrambling hard for a grip as her legs dangled helplessly over the alley. Owen lunged forward, grabbing hold of her arms and pulling with every ounce of strength he had left in him. She cried out in pain the moment he dragged her all the way onto the roof, and that is when he saw the dark stain spreading fast across her dress. A bullet had found its home. I'm all right, she gasped out, but her face was as pale as a ghost from the shock. It's just my arm. I can still move it. There was no time to stop and check the real damage. Hollering and the sound of boots told them their pursuers were now right on top of the boarding house roof. Owen gently helped Victoria get back to her feet, holding her steady as they stumbled over toward the roof access for the hatmaker's shop. The door was locked up tight, but one good kick sent splinters flying from the old wood. They scrambled down the narrow stairs and into the dark shop, feeling their way through all the dress forms and displays of fancy hats and ribbons. Back door, Owen whispered, guiding Victoria through the cluttered mess. Right behind them, they heard the crash of the roof door being busted clean open. Those fellas were getting mighty close. The back door of the shop opened up into a whole different alley than the one they had seen from up on the roof. Owen got his bearings in a hurry. The stables were about 2 blocks east, but with Victoria hurt and those armed men hot on their trail, he knew getting there was going to be tough. This way, he said, keeping a firm hold on her as they hustled on down the dark alley. Just stay close to the buildings. They moved as fast as Victoria's wounded arm would let them, ducking into dark doorways whenever they heard the sound of voices or approaching footsteps. By now, the whole town had come alive with the commotion. Curious neighbors were peeking from behind their windows, while others crept into the streets to see what all the fuss was about. They had almost reached the stables when their luck finally ran out. Rounding a corner, they came face to face with none other than Randall Porter himself, flanked by 2 of his hired thugs. The young banker's handsome face turned ugly with a sneer when he finally recognized Victoria. Well, well now, he drawled, his hand slowly moving to the polished pistol at his hip. My runaway bride has finally returned, and with a new fella no less. Owen quickly pushed Victoria behind him, his own hand hovering just above his gun. It's over, Porter. The bank examiner has all your father's crooked records. Federal marshals are already on their way. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across Randall's smug face. Then his arrogant confidence came rushing back. What unfortunate timing for you, then. By the time they finally arrive, you two will have met with some tragic accidents. This is a dangerous town at night. Owen knew they were outgunned and terribly outnumbered, but he also knew the whole town was now awake and watching, with witnesses all around us. Are you really fixin' to do this right here in front of half the town, Porter? Even your daddy's money can't buy that much silence. Randall paused for a second, glancing around at all the faces watching from windows and doorways. Then he let out a cold smile. You are right. It is much better to do this the proper way. He raised his voice. Sheriff, over here, I have found the bank robbers. Owen's heart just sank when he saw the town sheriff hurrying on over, his hand resting on his holster. In a town owned by the Porters, the law was just another tool in their collection. That is them, Sheriff, Randall continued. Smooth as you please. The pair who busted into the bank last night, dangerous criminals. The sheriff, a heavy-set fellow with a face that was always red, looked a little unsure. Bank robbery? I did not hear about any robbery, Mr. Porter. My father did not want to cause a panic, Randall replied, slick as ever. We were handling it nice and private. But now that you are here, I must insist these criminals be taken down to the jailhouse immediately. The sheriff looked from Randall over to Owen and Victoria, clearly torn between his duty and the will of the town's most powerful family, and his own gut instincts. Well now, they don't exactly look like bank robbers to me, said Mr. Porter. You better check that woman, Randall insisted. She is hurt because my guards shot her as they tried to get away from the bank. The sheriff took a cautious step closer, and that's when he noticed the blood on Victoria's dress for the very first time. His hands slowly moved down to the handle of his gun. That is not what happened at all, Victoria protested. Her voice was weak, but it was also strong. He is lying. We have the proof of the Porter's crimes about the bank examiner. Be quiet, Randall snapped at her. Sheriff, just do your duty. The tense standoff might have ended in a real bad way if fate had not decided to step in. A big commotion down at the end of the street suddenly drew everyone's attention. There were horses and riders moving fast, coming right toward them. As they galloped nearer, Owen recognized the shiny, distinctive badges of the United States Marshals. A wave of pure relief washed over him. Hawkins must have sensed the danger they were in and called for help much earlier than they had planned. The lead marshal was a tall, mighty, imposing man with a thick mustache. He reined his horse in right before them. What in the world is going on here, Sheriff? The local lawman shuffled his dusty boots nervously. Well, we are just apprehending some suspects, Marshal. Town business. Federal business now, the marshal corrected, dismounting. His cold gaze settled on Randall. Randall Porter. Randall straightened, summoning his dignity. Yes, and you are? Marshal James Calloway. You're under arrest for bank fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Randall's face drained of color. This is absurd. On whose authority? The United States government, Calloway replied without emotion. Bank Examiner Hawkins contacted us yesterday with compelling evidence of widespread fraud at Porter Bank. We've already secured the premises and arrested your father. As the reality of his situation dawned on him, Randall's composure cracked. Whatever they told you is lies. They're the criminals here. She stole from us, ran away. Save it for the judge, Calloway interrupted, gesturing for his deputies to take Randall into custody. He turned to Owen and Victoria. Miss Thornton, Mr. Newhome. Examiner Hawkins mentioned, you might be in danger. Looks like he was right. Owen nodded, still supporting Victoria, who was growing weaker from blood loss. She needs a doctor right now. She took a bullet during our getaway. Calloway did not waste a second and called for some help, and one of his deputies who had some medical training stepped right up to look at Victoria's arm. Went clean through the upper arm, he said after a good long look. It missed the bone, but she has lost a fair bit of blood. She needs proper care. With the marshal watching their backs, they finally made it to the town doctor. The old physician just shook his head and sighed at the wound, but he promised Owen it was not as bad as it looked. She will need plenty of rest and time to mend, but she is young and tough. She is going to be all right. As the doctor got to work, Marshal Calloway pulled Owen aside to explain things. Hawkins was mighty impressed by all the proof you brought him. He started his own investigation, paying real close attention to the accounts that Miss Thornton's father had pointed out. He found even more crooked dealings than what you had on your list. And what about the Porters? Owen asked. The head porter tried to make a run for it when we got to the bank this morning. He did not get far. A look of grim satisfaction settled on Calloway's face. We have been putting together the paperwork on these crooked bankers all across 3 counties. States, But the porters were just a little too clever. They were always one step ahead of the law. That evidence you brought us was the final piece of the puzzle. Owen felt a tremendous burden finally lift from his soul. So you are saying the porter's reign is truly at an end? Absolutely, Calloway said with a firm nod. They are being sent to St. Louis for the trial, far away from anyone they might be able to influence around here. Given the mountain of evidence, I fully expect they will be spending a very long time behind bars. As soon as the doctor finished tending to Victoria's injury, she made it clear she needed to speak with Marshal Calloway personally. Even though she looked pale as a sheet and was plainly exhausted, she gave him a full and precise account of her father's important discoveries and the terrible engagement to Randall they tried to force upon her, and every detail of her desperate escape. Your father would be so proud of you, Calloway told her softly when she was done. His courageous work will help return money to dozens of good families who were wronged by the porters. Victoria's eyes began to fill with tears. That is the only thing he would have wanted. He wanted justice for those folks, not payback. As evening settled in, the day's excitement in Willow Creek finally started to fade. The porters and all their hired thugs were locked up safe and sound in the town jail, with federal marshals watching over them. The bank was sealed up tight, waiting on a complete and thorough audit. Meanwhile, Victoria, just plain worn out from all the pain and heartache, finally fell into a deep sleep in her room at the widow Jensen's boarding house. Owen stayed right by her side, keeping a watchful eye. And that is exactly where Marshal Calloway found him the very next morning. He said, "I figured you ought to know we found some letters tucked away in old man Porter's desk. They were back and forth letters with the doctor, who was supposed to be treating Edward Thornton before he passed." Owen sat bolt upright, paying close attention now. The letters confirmed what Miss Thornton feared all along. It turns out her father was slowly poisoned over the course of several weeks. All of it made to look like his heart just gave out. The look on Marshal Calloway's face was mighty grim. "We've got the doctor in custody too, and he's already spilling his guts, trying to save his own hide." Owen's eyes went to Victoria's sleeping form. She looked so peaceful. He asked, "Are you going to tell her?" "She deserves to finally know the truth." Calloway answered, "I reckon it can wait a bit, at least until she gets some of her strength back." Owen nodded. He knew the marshal was right. Lord knows Victoria had been through enough already. Finding out she was right about her father's murder would bring a strange mix of pain and relief. But that was a fight for another day. There would be time for that later on. In the days that came after, the town of Willow Creek started to feel like a whole new place. With the Porter's stranglehold on the town finally broken, folks started speaking their minds freely about all the years they had been taken advantage of and scared. More proof of the bankers' wicked dealings started coming to light as former employees found the courage to step up and tell the truth. The true size of their crooked scheme turned out to be even bigger than what Victoria's own father had written down. As Victoria got her strength back, she and Owen talked about what came next for them. The worst of the danger was over, but there were still big decisions to be made. "I reckon I could stay here," Victoria said out loud one afternoon as they sat out in the garden at the boarding house. "Get my father's house back, maybe. There is a teaching job open over at the school." Owen looked at her real close. "Is that really what you want?" Victoria was quiet for a good long while. "This town holds so many memories for me, the good and the bad. My parents lived their lives here. They loved each other. Here, my father died right here." She turned to look Owen straight in the eye. "But my future is not here. I have known that since the very day I had to run away." "So where is your future then?" Owen asked, even though he had a pretty good idea what the answer was going to be. Victoria just smiled and reached out for his hand. "With you, if you'll still have me out on your ranch. Or we can find a new place if that's what you'd rather do. All I know for certain is I want us to be together." Owen gently brought her hand up to his lips. "I want that more than anything in this world." With their minds made up, they started getting ready to leave. Victoria's arm was mending nicely, but it was still gonna be a little while before she got all her strength back. Marshal Calloway had already taken her official statement, and he promised them they would be told when those porters finally went to trial. But they did not need to stick around in Willow Creek any longer. Before they left town, Victoria went to visit her parents' graves. She placed some fresh flowers and said her last goodbyes to them. Owen stood back a ways, respectfully, giving her the private moment she needed for this final farewell. I told them all about you, she said as she walked back over to him, about how you found me in that barn of yours that night, and how you changed my whole life. Owen just smiled, wrapping a strong arm around her shoulders. Well, I reckon my life is the one that changed the most. They rode out of Willow Creek on a clear and bright September morning, side by side. Thunder seemed mighty pleased to be back on the trail again, and Victoria was riding a gentle mare they got for her from the town livery, a gift from the good folks of the town. So what are we going to name her? Owen asked as they headed west for home. Victoria gave the horse's neck a soft pat. I am thinking Hope. It just seems right. Owen nodded, agreeing with her. Hope it is then. The ride back to Texas was a whole lot smoother than when they had run from it. They could ride right out in the open, not worried about anyone chasing them, just taking their sweet time and enjoying the trip. In the little towns along the way, they would sometimes catch wind of folks talking about that whole Porter mess, which had really become quite the topic of conversation among the big city bankers. When they at last came over the hill that looked down on Owen's ranch, they both felt a feeling of being home that was bigger than just the buildings waiting for them down below. Marcus was already back from his trip to lead the law astray, and he had kept the place in tip-top shape while they were gone. Well, look at that. Everything's just how we left it, Owen said as they moseyed down the hill to the house. Victoria could not help but smile, a peaceful look on her face that sure was not there when they had first crossed paths. Not quite everything. We are not the same people who left this place. Owen smiled right back at her. Heck no, we are not. We are a whole lot better. As they rode closer to the house, the front door swung right open and Marcus stepped on out, waving a big welcome. Right beside him stood Sheriff Wade Rogers, his wide face just breaking into a huge grin at the sight of them. Well, it is about time you two showed up, Wade called out. Marcus here was getting worried that you decided to just settle down in Missouri after all. Owen swung down from his saddle, helping Victoria down from her own horse. Not a chance of that. This is home. Wade's eyes immediately noticed Victoria's bandaged arm. Heard you two had some real excitement back in the East. Something about federal marshals and thieving bankers and every other kind of drama. Word sure travels fast, Victoria noted. Not as fast as those telegrams from the United States Marshals asking all about your character, Wade answered with a knowing wink. Seems you two made one heck of an impression on old Marshal Calloway. They all headed inside where Marcus had a wonderful welcome home meal waiting. Over supper and strong coffee, Owen and Victoria told the story of their adventures, though they were careful to soften the more dangerous parts of the tale when they saw the growing concern on Marcus's face. Well, what matters is you are home now, the old trainer Wade said with a firm nod once the story was told. And from the sound of it, that Porter crew will not be causing trouble for anyone for a good long while to come. At least 20 years based on what Calloway figures, Owen confirmed with a slow nod. And they are still adding more charges as they dig up the whole truth of that rotten scheme. Wade just shook his head, amazed by it all. It is hard to believe this whole mess started with me finding a brave young lady hiding out in your barn. Owen's hand gently found Victoria's underneath the table. It was the best thing that ever happened to Tomitro. Later on, as the sun bled crimson and gold over the Texas plains, Owen and Victoria stood together on the porch, his arm wrapped securely around her waist as they watched the big sky paint itself for the night. You know, I want to start planning our wedding, Victoria said, her voice clear and sure. I do not see a single reason in the world to wait. Owen looked down at her, a playful smile touching his lips. Well now, Miss Thornton, does that sound like a proposal to you? Victoria's laugh rang out, sounding as bright and free as a bluebird. I reckon it is, Mr. Newham. So what is your answer? Owen turned then to face her completely, taking both of her small hands into his. I say yes, 1,000 times yes. But you have to let me do this the proper way. And with that, he lowered himself down to one knee, still holding her hands. Victoria Thornton, you are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Victoria's eyes shimmered with happy tears. Yes, Owen, nothing would make me happier. He rose, pulling her into his arms and sealing their engagement with a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. They were married 2 months later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Wade Rogers stood as Owen's best man, and to Victoria's surprise and delight, Marshall Calloway made the journey from St. Louis to give her away. Marcus decorated the barn with wildflowers and lanterns, transforming the humble structure where they had first met into a place of celebration and new beginnings. As they spoke their vows beneath an archway of autumn flowers, both thought of the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. A desperate flight, a chance encounter, a simple offer of help that had changed both their lives forever. The years that followed brought many blessings. The ranch just flourished with the two of them working it together. Victoria had a real sharp mind for the business side of things, which was the perfect match for Owen's deep-down knowledge of the land itself. They started growing the place, adding more acres, more cattle, and more horses, even setting up a special pasture for those wild Mustangs Owen had always loved watching over on his uncle's property. Come the spring of their second year of marriage, Victoria brought a beautiful baby boy into the world. They named him Edward Samuel Newcomb, a fine name to honor both of their fathers. 2 years later, a sweet little daughter came along to join their family, Rose Maria, with her middle name being a special tribute to Marcus, who had become just like a grandfather to little Edward. They still got regular letters from back in Missouri, where that whole Porter case had set a new standard in banking law that sent ripples all through the nation's financial system. Victoria's father was finally honored after his passing and recognized for his incredible courage in writing down all that wrongdoing. And a part of the money they got back was put aside for a scholarship fund in his name at the local school. On those cool evenings when the children were fast asleep and the day's hard work was finally done, Owen and Victoria would often sit together on their porch. Just like they did in those early days. Sometimes they would talk about their adventures and all the danger they had faced and gotten through side by side. Other times they just enjoyed the peaceful quiet that settled between them, the kind that only comes from a deep and lasting love. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not found me that night? Victoria asked one evening, her head resting on Owen's shoulder as they watched a spectacular sunset paint the western sky. Owen thought about her question for a good long while. I try not to think about it. I reckon some things are just meant to be, darling. Victoria smiled, thinking about the frightened young woman she had once been, hiding out in a stranger's barn, and then the strong, confident wife and mother she had become. You are right, she agreed softly. Some things truly are meant to be. As darkness settled down over the ranch, Owen gave his wife's hand a gentle squeeze. I am grateful every single day that you chose my barn to hide in, Victoria Newcomb. She turned her face up to his, and love was just shining in her eyes. And I am grateful every single day that you found me, my cowboy. Their lips met, and the kiss was just as tender as their very first one, but it was filled with the weight of all their other years. It held every memory they had shared and the wonderful life they had built side by side. And to think that life had begun with one simple act of kindness on a dark and quiet Texas night. When a kind-hearted cowboy found a woman hiding out in his barn, he simply looked at her and said, Ma'am, you look like you are running from something serious. Please let me help you.